So now I want to turn it over to Sarah McQuade and introduce her. Sarah has been working as a consultant for Steel Sports for about 3 months now, with a focus on exactly what we just talked about, the Steel coaching system. Sarah has a very rich background in coach education. She worked on projects for the U.S. Olympic Committee and most recently led the development of the coaching curriculum for USA Football. She's presented at several national and international conferences and been published in several coaching journals. And so very excited to have her talk with all of you today around the topic of coaching excellence and reflective practice. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Dave. And good afternoon, everybody. It's when Dave says talk at you, it's kind of talk with you. And really what I'm going to do is to ask more questions than I am going to share answers. But what I just want to know is, does everybody have access to either the chat function or the question function box? Because I am going to be asking you questions throughout, so I just need to know that you've got the facility to type some 1 or 2 word answers. So just check where you can write. And I think I can only actually see some of the... Jolene, you may have to help me because my the functionality's gone a little bit.
Sarah, I can see it, and we've got a bunch of comments that people are in the questions section, so I think we're good there.
Okay. Dave, you might need to give me, because I can't actually see any questions at all. Whether it's the fact that I've given you organiser rights, I'm not sure, but I can't actually do anything with the screen at the side. So if there's some magic you can work whilst I introduce the session, that's great. If not, Jolene, you'll have to prompt me with the questions and some of the suggestions. But let me just sort of go back to the beginning. So Dave and I had a conversation and we'd started talking about the collective vision for excellence. And we started to think about, well, what is it that coaches can do to support this vision of excellence? And really, in order to support this vision of excellence, what we need is, very simply, you guys to be excellent. So the focus today is to start to think about or start to explore this concept of excellence. We want you to think what it is, what it means for you, and where you are in relation to excellence. And what we do know is that excellence and expertise really is only developed through practice, through time. So what we will do is explore the opportunities for learning and development within the coaching environment. And I want to spend most of my time looking at the role that reflective practice plays in terms of enhancing that performance. And then there'll be some questions to close to help you think about how you take some of this learning and look to move it forwards. So if we just think about coaching excellence, and I asked you the question, how do you define excellence? Just have a think about what that is. Do you define it based on whether people are beginners or experts? Do you define it based on win and loss records? Do you define it based on the quality of the athlete you produce? I don't know. Or do you define it based on their behaviours, based on what they say, what they don't say, what they do? I don't know. But have a little think, and again, this is where I need you to use the chat function box. I want you to think about what excellent coaching practice is and does. So think about the very best coaches that you know, and just think about what it is they say, what it is they do, and I just need you to write down those 1 or 2 words in either the chat or the question box. And I'm going to get Jolene to feed some of those back to me. So just take a minute, figure out what excellence is, and just make a quick note.
Sarah, this is Dave here. I've got all the feed that's coming to me, so I can read some of them. So we've gotten some great feedback. Directed questioning.
Yeah.
Motivational, bring the best out of the players on and off the court or field. Stay positive with mistakes. Returning participation. Communication and development. Learning. Confidence. Respecting teammates.
Fabulous. And it's interesting. Thank you, Dave. And I might need you to do this throughout the next sort of 45 minutes. But it's interesting, when you think about excellent coaching, not one of you have made any mention to what I would call the what to coach. So when we think about the what to coach, we think about the content, we think about what it is the players are doing, and we think about the technical skills of the sport. So we think about the X's and O's. So we think about what the players do. But it's interesting, not one of you have mentioned that. Actually, everything you've mentioned is wrapped up in this, what we call the how to coach or the coaching process piece. So it's all wrapped up in what the coaches do. And it's interesting, when we really start to think about excellent practice assumes that I have got high levels of technical expertise. And actually, what typically distinguishes an average coach from a great coach and a great coach from an excellent coach is their behaviours. It's what they do with what they know. And again, there was some research carried out a wee while ago that started to actually pinpoint expert actions of successful sports coaches. And I'm just going to share this list with you. And when you look at this list, compare that to the contribution that you've just given us, but also start to think about, on a scale of 1 to 10, where you are at in relation to each of these actions or these behaviours. 1 low, 10 high, 10 being excellent. So just start to pinpoint where you are at. And again, we don't need the answers. We really just want to prompt thinking inside your head. Remember here, you're comparing yourself to the very best. Creating a learning climate, effective communication, or pedagogy by pedagogy skills. So those are the teaching skills and strategies we use. Goal setting. And again, goal setting here infers that I'm able to set smart goals for my athletes, but also for myself and my staff. Planning and preparation. Observation and analysis, and reflective practice. And what's interesting here, I believe, and the research is alluding to this now, is that the difference that makes the difference in terms of expertise and excellent practice is an individual's ability to undertake critical, deliberate reflection. But before we get to reflective practice, I just want to start to think about what opportunities there are within the learning environment. And what I do want to do is to share with you the journey of a great chap called Danny Perry. He is the GB Women's Field Hockey head coach. I'm going to play some video footage, and I want you to pay attention to the first half of the video footage. Notice how he describes his coaching skin, his thinking processes, and his self-management skills.
My name is Danny Kerry, and I'm the England and Great Britain women's hockey coach. I've been involved since 2005. I never really considered being a manager or a coach when I was playing. Actually, I was asked towards the end of my career would I consider getting involved with coaching at a national league side. And the rest is history. I'm not sure I've ever felt 100% comfortable being in the skin of a head coach, and I think that's a good place to be. You're constantly reflecting back, projecting forward, and having to deal with it here and now, and it's something that consumes a lot of my waking moments. Some of these athletes I have worked with since 2005, they have literally, like myself, grown up with those 11 years. Their needs and wants as human beings change, and you have to evolve and change and accept that as well. One of the biggest lessons I've learned is if you can't manage yourself, how can you expect to have an effective working relationship with other athletes, with other staff? So that ability to self-regulate is key. However, it's absolutely fundamental that you have a passion for what you do. I think keeping my calm in really high-stake scenarios has been my greatest challenge as a coach. So I think never the finished article as an athlete or as a coach, and it's something I continue to work on. And inviting an athlete into the GB senior program, there are a huge array of things to consider. Probably the most important thing is actually are they in the right place in their life to take on the challenge. Picking them too early may actually work against them. To be a truly great hockey player, you really have to have an absolute passion and a self-belief. The journey is incredibly difficult. There are huge amounts of ups and downs, and you've got to keep coming back. I've certainly learned a huge amount about the power that you can leverage on with female groups. If you can get the culture right, if you can get the leadership right in your group, then female groups take on a power of their own. They can become incredibly nurturing of one another. They can become a real collective force. This current group of 31 players has an enormous amount of hockey talent, and I genuinely believe we can achieve truly great things.
And the answer to the question, where is he now, is simple. Gold, ranked complete underdogs going into the final match against the Dutch. They were world champions, but they won. And again, it's interesting, when you think about the words that Danny Kerry shares, he says he's not ever 100% comfortable. And I think that's a remarkable insight, because what that infers is that he never gets complacent and there's always opportunities to learn. He says that he's constantly reflecting. He's thinking backwards, he's thinking forwards, he's working in the here and now. He says that coaching is all-consuming. And again, he's not just referring to on the field and off the field training sessions. He's referring to the 24/7 lifestyle that is coaching. What I also heard was that when he talks about his growth, he talks about and places a heavy emphasis on the ability to manage yourself, the ability to self-regulate. He talks about managing relationships. And again, it's interesting to see, he doesn't talk an awful lot about the technical and tactical and the X's and the O's. But I think what is inspirational about this fellow is that after the 2008 games, his coaching approach was ridiculed. And he basically unpicked it, went back to the beginning, and he relearned his craft to the point where he is now. So that's Danny Kerry's learning. So let's just think for a minute about your most powerful learning. So reflect on key moments in your development as a coach. Think about where the very, very best pieces of learning happened. Was it as an athlete? Was it through observation of players' practice? Was it observing other coaches? So was it the stuff that happened in the coaching environment? Or did it happen when you were in a classroom, when you were on a formal coach education course? Did it happen because you got given feedback on that course? Did it happen when you were assessed? And again, most of the soccer coaches will relate to this, not necessarily the baseball. Most of the soccer coaches will have accessed and endured some of these coach education courses. Or actually, has some of the very best learning you've had come through mentored relationships? I don't know, and I don't need to know the answer. I do just need you to think about where that's come from. So if we then think about the different learning situations, and again, my job here isn't to bombard you with research, but the research tells us that there are two very discrete types of environments. So what you have on the left-hand side of the screen as we look at it is that formal learning stuff. It's the classroom stuff. It's the coaching awards, the coaching degrees, the seminars, the conferences. It's these type of situations, and typically they are mediated by experts. So somebody else is setting up and managing your learning for you. But actually what the research tells us is that the most powerful learning tends to happen when we're on the job. Now, my guess here is that lots of the learning on the job happens by accident as opposed to design. So what I want to help you think about is how can you harness some of this really fabulous learning so that you can start to learn by design and not accident. And there has been some massive research into, why is it that the coaching environment is such a powerful learning space? And it's because our learning is situated within the context in which it's applied. Now, and I think very simply, it's powerful because it's real, it's relevant, it's applicable, and it's a needs must. What I will also say that learning in the coaching environment only ever happens if you are open to new learning, if you are motivated to learn, and if you have the independent learning skills to do an unbelievably good job with those learning opportunities. So if we start to think a little bit about how coaches learn, and I want you to think here about your own preferences. So think about how you typically like to learn out of the range that's offered. So are you a great mimic? Do you learn by watching? And again, there's more levels of detail here. So when we think about observation, there's a whole series of follow-on questions that say, well, okay, what are you watching? What specifically are you watching? Are you watching the whole coaching picture, or are you watching elements of the coaching picture? If you're watching elements of the coaching picture, which coaching behaviours are you observing specifically? And again, so what we need to do is to be able to train our observation skills to actually look with a laser-like focus at specific stuff to help us learn. Otherwise, it can just become a little bit of a blur. Do you learn through conversation? Do you learn by chatting? I don't know, but that's deemed to be an unbelievably useful source of learning. Do you learn because you practice? There's been a huge amount of work done by a chap called David Kolb around experiential learning, and he talks about the opportunities that the practice environment gives us. And if we think about a number of opportunities of practice, and they're layered and layered and layered, what we have is a collection of experiences, which again is super useful. But it's only really useful if we think about what we've done. So, and I think all of these learning opportunities are wonderfully well placed, but if they're only taken in isolation, they're not going to work. Because what we have to do is think about what we've done to make sense of what we've seen and heard and practiced, so we can do something with it so we can get better. Yeah, I'm just going to pause for a second. Are there any questions? Because where I want to head now is to start to look at reflective practice in a bit more detail. So, Dave, I can't see the questions, but if there's any coming up, share them with us.
There's nothing so far.
Okay. If there are any questions that are hitting your radar, folks. Just jot them down and we'll either pick them up independently or we will pick them up at the end, so whichever suits you. So what I do want to do now is to sort of turn my attention for the next 15 minutes or so to look at the concept of reflective practice. Have a look at this definition. It's quite complex, it's quite academic, but just have a look. So at first glance, you might think, well, what the hell does that mean? So the throwing back of thoughts and memories in cognitive acts, such as thinking, contemplation, meditation, and any other form of attentive consideration in order to make sense of them and to make contextually appropriate changes. So that's what the research says. Danny Kerry says it's about constantly reflecting backwards and forwards in the here and now. But really, reflection, very simply, is thinking about what you've done to make improvements to what you are going to do. So thinking about what you've done to make improvements to what you are going to do. Now, there are two types of reflective practice. And again, I debated about whether sharing these with you, but I am. So if we think about it, and this has all been built on the work of a fellow called Sean, is that he talked about reflecting in action. So that's when you're sort of thinking, you're in the coaching moment, you're acting instinctively and you're responding on the hoof. And this concept of reflecting on action. So let's have a think about the difference between the two. So we've already thought about reflection in action is the decisions that you make on your feet. Inevitably, you're making decisions when the circumstances or the events take on an unfamiliar feel. So whether it's the fact that you are trying something new, whether you are integrating a new game or a conditioned game, whether you're introducing a new skill, so you've taken a bit of a leap of faith. And again, what we find is that we set up this particular coaching action and we're examining this coaching action, and then all of a sudden it doesn't look right, it doesn't feel right. And we have to make a decision in order to make it more right. So if we go back to the game that we might well have set up, we set up the game, we observe and analyse, and the question that begs is it working? Now, if the game is working, and the answer is yes, we should just leave it alone. Set it up, stand back, continue to observe, identify opportunities to use the game as the teacher, and use some real-time coaching to help individual performance. But equally, if I've set up the game and it's not working, what do? Do I leave it? Well, that's a bit like car crash television. Or do I have the confidence to be able to say, no, I've got to change, adapt, or modify this game? And then I've got to decide how to change, how to adapt, how to modify, and implement those actions. And again, you'll all be able to relate to this with some of the work you've done when you set things up in a coaching context and they're not working. You might be ready to tear your hair out, but actually what we need to think is, what are the alternative solutions? Having the confidence to make the changes is reflection in action. Potentially, the most powerful of the two types is reflection on action, because it happens afterwards. I'm not pressurised by time. I've got the luxury of time. And I can take my time to really think about what's happened. So I can analyse now whether it's decisions, whether it's player performance, whether it's certain game-based strategies, but I can analyse the decisions I've made to critically evaluate how effective they work. how effective they were. And I can do this by literally asking myself simple set of questions to help me think about, what did I do? Why did I do it? What worked unbelievably well? What didn't work? And critically, what might I do next time to actually improve this? So if we think then about the process, and I'm going to share with you a self-reflection cycle. So if we think about, and again, let's sort of focus on reflection on action. So what we know is that the event or the experience, whatever it is I've done, sits at the heart of this reflection cycle. And then there are a series of stages that I'm going to introduce you to. So one of these stages that we choose to evaluate are our feelings. So we start to explore, what did I think and feel about it? And again, we're kind of relying on instinct there. What was the instinct? Do I have a good gut feel about it or a fairly rotten gut feel? Or am I kind of sitting on the fence? I then attempt to evaluate it. What worked? What didn't? What was okay? And what I then would need to do with the evaluations is start to make sense of what happened. So Danny Kerry talked about looking backwards, looking forwards. So at this analysis phase, we start to think about, well, what worked? Why did it work? How did it work? What would I do differently next time? How would I carry this out onto the field with the players next week? What about a different group of players? But what I need to think about specifically is, once I've had this analysis in terms of making sense of everything that's happened, is drawing some fairly tangible conclusions. So if it did work, am I going to leave it alone? If it didn't work, what were the other options that I could have or should have tried, or that I can actually try next time? And the final stage of this reflection loop is the action planning. So this is the piece that I think is absolutely critical. Without this, I think we're a bit buggered. Because it doesn't actually matter where you choose to start in this reflection cycle. You have got to commit to moving around each stage. So I know when I am reflecting, I immediately go to the evaluation. I immediately start with, that didn't work, that didn't work, that didn't work. And I try and fault fix and find. But actually, I have got to go full circle so that I can start to layer the learning. So it doesn't matter where you start, you've got to implement the changes you want to make. So what we're doing is literally cycling up. We don't want to repeat the same behaviour for the next 1, 5, 10, 15 years. We want to improve. We want to develop excellence. Any questions? Dave, Jolene, any questions coming in?
Still nothing yet.
Well, we're either blinding them with some fabulous stuff, or they've all fallen asleep. Hope it's the former. Okay, I have some questions for you. And again, this is all content free. I do not need to know the answers. You certainly need to know the answers. So be really honest now when I ask you the questions. And again, what we can do is to make this slide deck available to you if it's going to be useful. So here are the questions, and really I want you to reflect on how you reflect. So, do you engage in reflective practice? How often? When do you do it? Is it after the session? Immediately after the session when you're walking off the field, or do you take some time to do it later on that evening? Where do you do it? Do you sit down at a desk? Do you do it on the edge of the field? Do you do it in the car going home? Do you undertake reflective practice with real purpose? So go back to my question about where do you reflect? If you reflect in the car going home, how do you capture all those fabulous reflections? What happens when you get home and you open the car door? Where do all of those fabulous reflections go? Do they just sort of float up into the ether? I don't know. How long do you reflect for? And again, I don't know how long is, or how long needs to be, but it certainly needs quality time. What tools do you use? So what strategies do you use to help you reflect? And here's the kicker. How do you use the thinking you generate? What do you do with it? How do you use it? Do you use it? And another question, does anybody help you? So do you do this in isolation, or does anybody help you do it? If you do it in isolation, how can you get that 360-degree perspective, which is so important? How can you see your own blind spots? Again, I don't know the answer to the question.
Sarah, we do have some comments that have come through that I thought would be good to share. There was a handful of comments just that people are enjoying all the content here.
Okay.
And one specifically that I thought I'd read said, yes, I actually engage in reflective practice for up to 30 minutes. I reflect in a quiet place, on my deck, driving home, or before meditation. And then there's two questions that came through. One is, how do you address that the core of self-reflection is honesty and not self-promotion?
I'm just writing down the question, Dave. So the core being honesty or self-promotion?
Yeah, the core is honesty and not self-promotion. And then tied to that question is, when self-reflection is tied into evaluation, it frequently becomes a chance to self-applaud.
And as it should, assuming that self-applaud also is coupled with a critical self-reflection that starts to look at, A, we celebrate success, but B, are we really looking into the margins to identify what are the differences or what are the elements of performance that I'm really not so happy about? You know, and it's interesting, high-quality reflection is only as good as the reference points I am using to frame that reflection. So if we think about this, reflective practice is an act of sort of comparing and contrasting. What I'm doing is contrasting my performance with best practice. Now, best practice can come in the form of a model, or an example, or somebody that we know who does an unbelievably good job. It can come in the form of a series of coaching behaviours or observable behaviours that, so I know UK Elite have a number of observable behaviours that they look at in the field. But equally, it can be against any reference points. Now, I think true reflective practice only works if we compare and contrast exactly what we are doing against these really informed reference points. Now, if we think about this, and again, I don't know whether you can see my hands, but what I want to do is sort of indicate the level. So, excellent practice is here. And again, we never quite achieve excellence because somebody's always lifting the bar. Somebody's always raising the bar. And what we need to do to ensure that reflective practice helps us move forward, we need to be comparing ourselves with reference points that are pitched slightly above the level that we're at, because that's what gives us the stretch. So we need to be constantly reaching. There's a danger if I compare myself to reference points that are a little bit low or lower, then I'm into self-applaud and lots of self-applaud, and really the exercise is redundant. So what I would say is use markers that just help with the stretch. I would also say, for any coach who's going into a coaching session, I know that you go into the coaching session with some really well-framed goals for your athlete. how often do you go in with some really well-framed goals for you, but give you a specific hook to reflect on afterwards? So how often do you say, I'm going to use 10 really good learning questions in my session, and I'm going to reflect on how well I've used them at the end? So it's that level of specificity that really helps the process.
Sarah, there's two other questions that I'd like you to address. One is, what's the difference between reflecting and thinking about it over and over and beating yourself up when something fails?
The difference is with the reflective piece. So if we go back to the cycle I've just introduced you to, the difference between beating myself up and reflecting is that I do something with what I've learned. So that's the real challenge with the reflective practice. I identify the tangibles that I can pick up and take to the next experience. So we can think till the cows come home, we may well not learn because we haven't used the cycle to help us navigate the issues that that particular experience has faced us with.
Great.
Was there another one, Dave?
Yeah, the next one is, how do you help coaches control their emotional behavior so they can make better decisions?
I think that's a whole nother webinar. But, you know, really, I mean, what you're talking about there are two very discrete coaching behaviours. One is around EI, one is about decision making. So really, if we want to help coaches help themselves to do much better with their emotional intelligence and their decision making capacity, we've got to ensure that they know what fabulous EI is and what great decisions look like and sound like. They need to know how decisions are framed. They need to know what relevant information to process to make good decisions. So really what I would say is that there's a lot of learning to be done for the coach to be able to develop a really detailed understanding of the coaching behaviours that they want to develop.
Great.
So again,
one other question, Sarah, is reflecting with a group of other coaches a good strategy, and what are some of the benefits of that compared to self-reflection?
Yeah, I think it's a fabulous strategy, and I think the opportunities for shared learning are immense. What I would say, if there are any group reflections that are going on, ideally they should be facilitated, emphasis on the facilitated, by a coach developer who can ensure that they use a group review process to actually draw out some of the specific learning and then help coaches figure out how they can apply that specific learning in their own context. So again, the emphasis on the application piece is really critical. And again, a really good facilitator will be able to help with and so what does this look like in your coaching environment? How will you implement it? What will success look like? How will you know you've done a great job? So I think, yeah, the shared reflections are immensely useful as long as everybody's engaged and everybody has the opportunity to apply it.
Great. That's all the questions for now.
Okay, brilliant, great questions. I will be curious to know where they've come from at the end of this. So I'll get a copy of the script afterwards. But if we think about, and again, there's just a couple more slides to sort of throw at you, is when we think about reflective practice, there are a number of tools that we can use that are massively helpful. So just to throw a couple at you, a watch. It's a heart rate monitor technically, but I couldn't find a watch as quickly as I might well have done. But really, the watch here helps you analyse the stats. So I'll give you one example. Often as coaches, we tend to provide overly long and complex instructions. How many of you have ever timed yourself to think about how long does it take me to set up, stand back, observe and analyse? Is it 10 seconds? Is it a minute? Is it 3 minutes? Good old pen and paper. If you had a look at my desk, it is surrounded by bits of pens and paper everywhere. How often Do you write a note to yourself in the future? How often do you promise yourself to say, in 3 months' time, I'm going to do X, Y, Z? So what we're talking about there is the future planning. How many of you do look forward? There are a ridiculous amount of apps available on smartphones nowadays. How many of those do you use? Yes, we all use the video camera unbelievably well because we record our athletes. We get them to record themselves. We use the playback function and the slow-mo and the time. There's the opportunity to use the dictaphone and the notes functions. But how many of you use your mobile phones to access different communities of practice? There are huge numbers of communities of practice now. One I can think of called Connected Coaches, a UK-based site that allows coaches to engage in group learning. So there's sharing, thinking, reflection. So how often do we use the interactivity that comes in the computer in the palm of our hand? I am sure you use coaching apps to analyse your players. How many of you use it to analyse yourself? Sorry. How often do you actually record yourself and share the recording of your coaching footage with a mentor over Skype? I do some mentoring with international coaches across the globe. I can't begin to tell you how many coaching sessions I have seen via Skype. Unbelievably useful when we think about how others can help us. Goal setting. So this is me now, future me. How often do you think about where you want to be and how you want to go? You set markers for your players. Do you set markers for yourselves? Because that's absolutely critical when we start to think about how we layer the learning. How many of you are brave enough to ask somebody else to video record you? And again, that's critical when we think about sort of the Skype and the coaching eye, but just literally turning a camera on yourself, it's a huge revelation. And inevitably, the conversation that we have with others to help us reflect is massively useful. So when we choose to seek meaningful feedback from others, so who are they? I guess the first question is, can they help? Who are they? Who do you respect enough to listen to? What do you want from them? And I always think that, when we're seeking feedback from others and we start to think about mentoring, really we're asking mentors to hold a mirror up to our own performance, because sometimes we can't see our blind spots. Very difficult to see the back of your head. But actually the mentor will help us start to see things that we can't see. So think about the mirror analogy. How close do you want them to hold that mirror? Is it full length? Or do you want them to zone in on a particular piece of your coaching practice? What angle do you want them to hold it from? And again, it all depends on what you want to see. And what you want to see is going to be informed by the reference points we talked about earlier. They're going to be informed by the professional development plan you have and the aspirations you have to achieve excellence. And then, of course, we have to think about when, where, and how will this happen? And again, we need a private space, a quiet space, a useful space to be able to do it. And again, what's incredible now, the remote technologies allow this to happen on a global perspective. So if we think about this, and again, let's come back to Danny Kerry's point, and he talks about the ability to manage yourself and the ability to self-regulate. It's up to you. So if you genuinely feel that there is mileage in this reflective practice game, let me ask you a couple of questions. What will you focus on? How will you decide what you focus on? So what are the reference points? What are the markers? What's the excellent behaviour you're trying to develop? When can you do it? How much time can you invest? How often? The 30 minutes a day is fabulous. I am very envious. Where? And the kicker again here is, how will you apply your learning? So we're doing all of this reflection. We'll identify the tangibles so we can make differences to the next experience. So how will you apply your learning? How will you know you've been successful? Then what? And again, reflective practice is a never-ending process. And what we're doing is using this to layer our learning so that we can develop excellent behaviours. So I will pause and just throw out the last 5 minutes we've got to some questions. Dave?
Yeah, I'm still waiting here. No questions have been submitted so far.
Okay. If there are questions, so if there are sort of ongoing questions about any of the sort of, reflective practice processes, any sort of wider reading, if people are interested, I will happily signpost them to different bits and pieces if they sort of believe it's useful. And again, if people are still here and haven't quite sloped off, I promised you at the beginning that this webinar would ask more answers than questions. But really, if you can identify the answers to those questions, I think you'll have a really informed plan to A, undertake reflective practice even better than you do now, but B, you'll have a far better idea around the process by which you can reflect to make performance improvements in your own coaching. Remembering, of course, that our aspiration is this excellent bar.
Sarah, there is a question here that I'd like you to address. The hardest part as a coach has to be prioritizing. Reflection is great without unlimited time, but where do you draw the line between time spent on reflection and other items that might be on your list as a coach?
It is a great question. And I'm not sure that I can answer it perhaps as well as this coach might like. But I do think, and it's interesting, I learned this from USA Football. As athletes, as coaches, we are unbelievably competitive. We want to be the first in the list, because we are in the lift or the elevator, because we want to be the very best that we can be. So I know as coaches, you're not going to be happy with second best or second rate coaching performances. So I know that if it is important to you to be the very best coach you can be, you'll find the time to do it. Now, if you can find the time to do it, if that's just snapshots which are layered across the course of the day, that's absolutely fine. At least you're doing it. We can have those snapshots while we're walking on and off the field, walking in between sessions. The trick is to figure out how to capture those snapshots. And I'm willing to bet every one of you travels everywhere with a mobile phone. Use the notes section, use the dictaphone, whatever it is you have to do to carry those snapshots, because that's not going to require any additional time. You're just making unbelievably good use of the time you've got available. But I think reflective practice is absolutely critical if we want to develop excellence.
I like that, Sarah. Just a few follow-up thoughts that I have, because we want to end on time here, and we're a minute away from 12 o'clock Pacific, 3 o'clock Eastern. As Sarah was talking, I think the key word that came to mind for me was continual learner. That's really what we have to focus on, and that's part of reflection, is that you want to reflect so that you can continue to learn. And if you haven't read this book, I have a book that I want to suggest to everybody, and that's Growth Mindset, which is written by Carol Dweck, a world-renowned researcher at Stanford University. And she talks about the growth mindset versus fixed mindset. So the fixed mindset is essentially, either my athletic ability or what I know is what I was born with, and that's, what I'm going to be able to do. Versus growth mindset, which is, there's always more that you can do to learn and develop. And she's just got some fascinating research that I encourage you guys to read. And if you don't have time to pick up the book, if you just look up Growth Mindset Carol Dweck online, you'll see a lot of her research there. And then a practical example that I want to share, during my time when I was at Positive Coaching Alliance, I got to know Phil Jackson a little bit, who has won 11 or 12 NBA championships as a coach and also was a very successful player. And one of the key things he talked about in every talk that he gave was that he had this mindset that as soon as he felt like he wasn't learning anymore, that was when he knew it was time for him to retire. So although he had all this great success, he was always trying to learn more and more. So I thought that line really rang true and made me think of that as Sarah was going through the webinar. The next webinar that we're going to have for everybody will likely be in early December, as we're trying to do this on a quarterly basis. So if you have speakers that you think would be beneficial or topics that you'd like to see us cover, make sure that you put that in the survey response. You'll get an email immediately after the webinar here with a set of questions. So make sure you share your feedback both on this webinar and then ideas for future topics. Before we turn it off, Sarah, anything that you want to add before we close here?
No, I've said quite enough.
Great. We did have a good comment that I'll close with that Steve Jones, the Director of Coach Education and Development for UK Elite, wrote. He said, in our field, the final 20 minutes of each practice is a scrimmage phase that we encourage staff to use to assess the level of success the players are displaying, physically and intellectually. But also, this is a time when they can reflect on their own success in terms of the session that just took place.
Brilliant.
So thank you for sharing that comment. Very helpful. Everyone have a great rest of the week, and thanks for spending the time on the webinar with us. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, everybody.